Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Substitution study, Philippe Lucas.
I love it. Thank you very much, Lyft, people of Lyft, cannabis community. It's great to be here again at another Lyft event. This is one of my favorite places to present anywhere because this whole gathering of the cannabis community, of patients, of recreational users, celebrating their freedom means tremendous amount to me. I've been involved in medical cannabis for about just over 20 years now. I came to this initially as a patient when I was diagnosed with hepatitis C in 1995, which I'd gotten through tainted blood here in Ontario. In 1999, I started one of Canada's first medical cannabis dispensaries, the Vancouver Island Compassion Society. I ran that for about 10 years' time. Took a short interlude to go into politics. I was a city councillor in Victoria from 2008 to 2011. And then ultimately started working at Tilray about 3 years ago, which is a licensed producer here in Canada. So today, it's my great pleasure to share with you guys the results of the largest patient survey done in Canada so far. I'm going to start out with a brief introduction to Tilray, tell you a little bit about the Canadian Medical Cannabis Council, which is an industry association of which I'm executive director, and then we'll go right into some data. It's going to focus on patient patterns of use and the use of cannabis as a substitute for licit and illicit substances. So a little bit about Tilray. We're the first medical cannabis company anywhere in North America to be GMP certified. For those of you who may not know what GMP means, it means that we're producing cannabis at a pharmaceutical grade, so at the same level of standard quality and safety as traditional pharmaceutical medications. We've got over 50 strains that we grow at Tilray, multiple methods of ingestion, including drops, and next week, I'm so happy to share with you guys, we're going to be releasing some of Canada's first cannabis caps, so capsules are going to be released next week. So for those of you who are patients, this is a great option as well, and I just like being able to increase options to patients. It's been kind of my philosophy in doing this over the last 20 years. Tilray's got 160 full-time staff and a 60,000 square foot, $30 million facility in Nanaimo, BC. And 2 weeks ago, we won the Chamber of Commerce Best Employer of the Region Award. I just want to say how far this industry has come that a cannabis company can win the Best Employer of the Region Award. We've come so far, my friends, and Lyft is a good example of celebrating that right now. As I mentioned, we are the first GMP certified medical cannabis company in Canada, in North America actually, and also the first licensed producer to publish peer-reviewed research. A few months ago, I published the results of our 2015 patient survey focused on substitution effect and the use of cannabis instead of opioids. And what I'm sharing with you guys today is actually the results of the 2017 patient survey. Tilray offers a number of different cannabis options, as I mentioned, and cannabis extract products. These are some of the products we have under development. And right now we've got caps that are coming out next week, and of course our drops. This is what's coming out next week. It's going to be coming out in 2 formulations, 1:1 THC CBD, and then a high THC at 10 milligrams of THC. The Canadian Medical Cannabis Council, if you guys don't know about this organization, we're right over there. We got a great booth. We're made up of Tilray, the Peace Naturals Project, Delta 9, Redecan, and Delshin. And what distinguishes us are 2 things. We're industry leaders serving 30,000 patients with a real high ethical standard. We don't pay kickbacks for patients. And what that means is we're not paying for you, if you're a patient, for you to join us. We want to maintain your right to choose your own grower. We don't want a clinic telling you who you should get your cannabis from. On top of that, we put a real patient-centered lens on all of our policies and practices. We're the only industry association that has a patient advisory committee. And that committee is made up of the Arthritis Society, the Canadian AIDS Society, Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana, Wellness Soldier, the Canadian Cancer Survivors Network, the Hospice and Palliative Care Association, Improving the Lives of Children, and the GI Society and Epilepsy Alliance of Canada. So we try and get a broad representation of patient-centered organizations to make sure that you as a patient are represented in our decisions. Tilray has really distinguished itself as a leader in research, and in fact, we're doing more clinical research than any cannabis company in the world. We're doing a phase 2 clinical trial on medical cannabis and post-traumatic stress disorder right now at UBC. At 42 participants, it's the largest clinical trial of medical cannabis to take place in Canada in at least 40 years. And it's currently recruiting. It's underway. We're comparing 10% THC cannabis, 10% THC, 10% CBD cannabis, and placebo. And we're using a Storz and Bickel Mighty as the method of ingestion. All of our participants go home once a week with 7 2-gram vials, and they use as much or as little as they want. It's a very naturalistic design for a study. We're also doing a study right here in Toronto at the Sick Kids Hospital, or the Hospital for Sick Children, which is a study of pediatric epilepsy. You guys might have heard that CBD is useful in the treatment of pediatric epilepsy and reducing seizures. We want to look into that, and so right now we've got 20 kids in the general Toronto area who are using a specialized product through oral ingestion in order to look at its effects in reducing seizures. We've got a study of COPD at McGill. These very well-known respirologists contacted Tilray because they'd like to see if vaporized cannabis can actually help improve COPD. It's not an indication I would have thought of off the top of my head. We're really fascinated by the outcome of this study, and if it can help folks, particularly seniors with COPD, we're very excited about this as well. And we're doing a study of nausea and vomiting as a side effect of cancer treatment, and that's a relationship with the government in New South Wales and Australia. Tilray exports cannabis and cannabis products to Australia, to Chile, and to the EU. So we're now sending cannabis products made right here in Canada, in British Columbia, all over the world for use through medical marijuana programs or in clinical research. And on top of that, the last study I want to mention is the Tilray Observational Patient Survey. I'm tracking 1,000 patients, well right now 640 or 50 or so, and their use of medical cannabis and the impact on quality of life and prescription drug use over a 12-month period in order to see how medical cannabis can improve quality of life and impact the use of prescription drugs longitudinally. We should have results of that study available in the coming 6 months. Now, today what I really want to share with you guys are the results of this Tilray patient survey. This is a survey that I conducted in January 2017. It was sent out to 16,000 Tilray patients. And just so you guys know, licensed producers in Canada can ship all over Canada. And so Tilray has, although we're BC based, we have patients all over the country. Our biggest concentration of patients is actually Ontario and Alberta. And so these patients were representative of patients all over Canada. We got 2,032 responses of patients who gave us a Tilray patient number, so we know for sure they're federally authorized patients. And today I'm going to share these results with you guys. These are pre-publication. We'll be looking to publish these results in the summer, and I can't wait to share them. So the average age that we saw was 40 years old. Now, I find that really significant because you guys will know that there's still a lot of people out there who think that the medical cannabis program and the use of medical cannabis is just something that 18-year-old men kind of use as a cover-up for their prescription drug use. I can tell you guys I've been working on medical cannabis for the last 20+ years. What I see overwhelmingly are middle-aged individuals who failed out of traditional treatment. That's who comes to medical cannabis typically, and that's what we're seeing more and more of. You'll notice the gender balance in the study. We've got about 62% men, about 38% women. And there's a very good reason for that, is that men are more criminogenic than women. And what that means is men are more likely to commit a crime. And so when it comes to cannabis use, whether it be recreational or medical use of cannabis, we're early adopters. But what I find really encouraging about this statistic is that when I did this study in 2015, it was only about 25% women. So women and seniors are the fastest growing group of medical cannabis patients in our medical marijuana program right now. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that there's a number of conditions where the prevalence as women is much higher than men, such as MS, lupus, fibromyalgia, and they're starting to come to medical cannabis to look for treatments for those conditions because they respond really well to medical cannabis treatment. I always ask patients when I do these surveys, what's your primary condition? And they're allowed to click one box. And then I ask, what are your primary symptoms? And they can click multiple boxes. And what that means is, if your primary condition is MS, your primary symptoms might be chronic pain, they might be GI issues and insomnia. So in this case, we found when we asked about primary condition that 40% cited a mental health condition when you combine insomnia, mental health, and PTSD. For pain, it was a combination of arthritis, chronic pain, and headache, and it's about 37%. So this is the first survey I'm aware of that's taken place anywhere in North America that's found mental health to just be edging out pain as a primary condition. And I have to tell you guys, in 10 or 15 years of doing these patient surveys, I've been seeing this growing use of medical cannabis as a treatment for mental health, which is kind of fascinating. And when we go to primary symptoms, we see a very similar dynamic, which is that chronic pain is the #1 symptom patients cite at 57%. But that's quickly followed by anxiety at 49%, insomnia at 46%, and stress at 46%. So what we really see is that in Canada, patients are using medical cannabis as a treatment for pain and for mental health conditions largely. Now, you'll also note from these two slides that there's a lot of use for MS, for dystonic movement disorders, for GI issues. And so certainly it's not the only reason, but the primary reasons are pain and mental health. I asked patients how many days per use do you use, and we see 74% cite that they use cannabis daily. So this suggests to me these are chronic conditions. They have the conditions every day, the symptoms of the conditions every day, and they use treatment each and every day. That's an overwhelming majority using every day. How many grams do you use? We find that the average use in this survey is 1.5 grams per day. And that's very consistent in about 15 years of surveying patients in Canada, the US, and also in the EU. Most patients use between 0.5 and 1.5 grams a day, and about almost 80% of our patients actually use less than 3 grams per day. And you do see the outlier there. There are some patients who use 4 grams or more. There are some conditions that really need these higher patterns of use. But overwhelmingly over the last 15 years, the data is consistent. People use between 0.5 and 1.5 grams a day. When we ask about primary methods of use, I'm super encouraged to see over the last 15 years that the use of vaporizers has really grown. And the #1 way that patients use medical cannabis in Canada right now is through vaporization. And in fact, if you add up vaporization and oral use, which is edibles or extracts, and juicing, you find that about half of patients in Canada no longer smoke cannabis. This is not really a smoke medicine the way it was 10 or 15 years ago when I started down this road with medical cannabis. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think it shows a really health-conscious shift by medical cannabis patients. I think we can see here today that the vaporization technology has gotten cheaper and better over the years. And I think that the anti-smoking laws that have gone out in Canada, all over Canada and North America, have shifted people over to more discreet methods of ingestion like vaporization. In terms of favorite cannabis, you'll see that there's a slight favoring of indicas, which isn't surprising when you see mental health and pain being the primary mentions of why patients are using medical cannabis. And in fact, if you add up indica, sativa, and hybrid, you find that about 70% of patients are using high THC cannabis when they're using flower cannabis, so smoking or vaporization. When I show you the data on extracts, you're going to see that turn on its head a bit, where you see much higher use of CBD products. So we asked patients are using these extract products, and about 40% of patients say they're using extracts right now. And as I mentioned, that what we're finding is that about 50% of patients who cite a favorite type of extract are using higher CBD products, either 1-to-1 or 3-to-1 CBD products. I broke down the data further for a recent presentation of Veterans Affairs Canada, and we actually see PTSD patients favoring 3-to-1 at a much higher rate, which is kind of interesting as well. Now, I think there's a few reasons for that. I think patients who use extract products who are still working and in the workforce may find them more discreet, so they're using them during the day, which suggests they might be using a higher CBD product because they're less intoxicating. There's less impairment associated with these. And I think that the higher THC products are mostly being used at nighttime to help people with sleep and to deal with pain issues longitudinally over periods of sleep. We asked how many days in the past week have you used extract products, and about 30% of patients use them every day. You'll remember that when it comes to flower products, it's 70% use every day, so we're not seeing the same frequency of use of these extract products at this period in time. I asked about private insurance coverage because, one of the battles I fought over 20 years of medical cannabis is making sure that any patient who needs access to cannabis can get it, and that cost is no longer an impediment. And cost is all too often an obstacle to access for patients. So 21% of Tilray patients have access to private insurers, but only 3% are getting coverage for their cost of cannabis. And as you can see from this next slide, most of those are patients with Veterans Affairs. Now, I think most of you know this, but veterans in Canada, whether they're police, military, or correction agency veterans, get 100% of the cost covered. That's changed a little bit, I shouldn't say that. Get up to $25 a day covered, and up to, so basically 3 grams of cannabis a day covered by Veterans Affairs Canada. But what's really encouraging in this slide is that Blue Cross, Great West Life, ICBC in BC, Sun Life, Wawanesa, the big insurers in Canada are also covering the cost of cannabis for some patients some of the time. If you have private insurance, you can currently use medical cannabis and charge it to your healthcare savings account. It's a CRA charge. You're 100% legally allowed to put it to that. And if you have a private insurer, contact them to see if you can get broader coverage and encourage broader coverage for medical cannabis. One of the things that I'm currently doing, and I do this with Jonathan Said at Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana, and with a couple of other groups, is advocating for increased coverage of medical cannabis and with these private insurers. And we want to make sure that they hear from patients and physicians that this should be covered, because that's really going to encourage them to consider it. My niche area of research really over the last 10 years is cannabis substitution effect. I'm a graduate researcher with the Center for Addictions Research of British Columbia, and as well as being VP for Patient Research and Access for Tilray. And I've kind of changed the way I ask this question about substitution effect for patients. I now ask patients, have you ever, are you currently using prescription drugs? Have you ever, are you currently using alcohol? Have you ever, currently using tobacco? And then I ask, if they say, yes, I have, or am currently using, I ask, have you ever substituted for? Now, it's no surprise, and very consistent with past research, that we find that most of the substitution with a medical cannabis patient group is prescription drugs. And that's followed, though, with a high rate of substitution for alcohol, for tobacco, and for illicit substances. Now, when it comes to prescription drugs, patients can actually list 3 substances specific pharmaceuticals they're substituting for. And so when they do, we find that overwhelmingly the actual drug group they're substituting for are prescription opioids. So it makes up about, well, just over 1/3 of all the citations for prescription drugs are for opioids, and that's quickly followed by antidepressants, non-opioid pain medications, and also benzodiazepines. So when you know that medical cannabis is being used to treat pain and mental health, it's really no surprise to see painkillers and antidepressants and SSRIs, SNRIs as the main drugs patients are substituting for. Now, I don't need to tell you guys that we have an opioid overdose crisis, and in later slides, I'm going to talk about how cannabis might be able to interrupt that opioid overdose crisis. Now, when I used to show this slide, doctors would say, yeah, but how do we know how much they're substituting for? Are they just using cannabis once a year instead of using an opioid pill, or are they giving it up altogether? So I started asking that question. I said, are you substituting for each drug that you listed? Are you substituting 100%, 75%, 50%, or 25%? And here's what we found. 458 of the patients in this survey cite they substitute for 1 or more opioid medications, and the total mentions of opioid drugs is 610 opioid drugs. Out of those 610 opioid mentions, patients stopped using 60% completely. They gave them up completely, no longer using them. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Lauren. 18% reduced them by at least 75%. So the total reduction is that almost 80% of the opioid reduction was for 75% or more. There's no other way to look at it. Cannabis can save lives when you look at it that way. Now, I also am interested about substitution for licit and illicit substances, and it's really encouraging to see that 31% of these participants say they gave up alcohol completely when they started using medical cannabis. Now, why is that important? Well, alcohol is the most criminogenic substance in North America and around the world. It leads to more violence, more property damage, and more abuse than all the other drugs combined. And in fact, in medical marijuana states in the US and where they've legalized recreationally, they've not only seen a reduction in youth use of cannabis, which is quite remarkable, they've seen a reduction in alcohol-related automobile deaths, reductions in domestic violence, reductions in violent crime, homicides, and suicides, all of which are associated with alcohol use and reductions in alcohol use. As Canada moves towards legalization, I really hope and believe that that's what we can expect here too, as we see a population and reasonable adults being able to have an alternative between cannabis and alcohol, with some choosing to use cannabis rather than alcohol. When it comes to tobacco, this is really fascinating stuff because I only started asking about tobacco a couple of years ago. Remarkable to me that 405 respondents who substituted for tobacco, over 50% say they stopped using it completely. Now, the public health impacts of looking at cannabis as a tobacco cessation agent is really significant. This bears more research, and it's certainly an area where I'm going to seek, actually, where I'm writing up an independent publication, because this data itself is kind of blew my mind in and of itself. So I think we need to really look at the way that we can use this data to inform youth as well. I think that in Ontario, where it's still common to roll cannabis with tobacco, we need to have public service messages not to combine these two substances. In BC, you get kicked out of parties for that, so you don't have to worry about it too much. We're not the only ones, and I'm certainly not the only person looking at cannabis substitution effect. There's a great publication by a researcher named Huber in the US from the Journal of the American Medical Association that in 2014 found that medical cannabis states compared to non-medical cannabis states had a 25% reduction in opioid overdose deaths. Really remarkable, and what's even more remarkable is the longer the medical marijuana program was available in those states, the greater the reduction in opioid overdose deaths. There's also a great study by Ullman recently that found a decline of 8% in workplace absenteeism due to sickness. So medical cannabis keeps patients healthy. It keeps them going to work, not the other way around. And according to Veterans Affairs Canada and their own data, at the same time as we've seen this significant rise in the number of vets using medical cannabis, we've also seen a subsequent decline of 16% in the use of opioids and a full 30% in the prescriptions they track for benzodiazepines. So this is very consistent with what we're finding and what patients are telling us as well. Now, I do want to touch on the opioid overdose situation just a little bit because it's so significant here. In Vancouver, in a single day recently, or in British Columbia, in a single day in March, we had 160 overdoses in a single day. The biggest cause and the leading cause of accidental death in Canada and the US right now is opioid overdoses. It well overshadows drinking and driving in youth now. You're more likely to die of an opioid overdose than you are a car accident if you're a youth right now. Opioid addiction is driving this epidemic, and 4 out of 5 injection drug users started out with prescription opioids. So this is something that's starting with medical use and it's diverting into recreational or personal use and drug use and dependence. And I think that there's 3 opportunities for cannabis to intercept this opioid overdose cycle. The first one is an introduction. So when doctors are looking at a patient and talking to a patient about chronic pain, a lot of the time they'll put them through Tylenol, what we call these frontline treatments first. You go through Tylenol, that doesn't help, etc. Second line treatments are opioids. Third and fourth line treatments are cannabinoids. We need to reverse that right away. It's just not in keeping with the available science. Cannabinoids and cannabis is nowhere near as dependence forming. It has no risk of overdose or death. So that should be a second line treatment option, with opioids moving to third or fourth line. If patients don't do well on cannabis, then we can consider opioids. Because if they never start in that opioid cycle, they're not going to walk down that level of dependence. And the party's falling apart. The second part is in reduction, which is if you're already having success in treating chronic pain using opioids, cannabis can help repotentiate those opioids, which means you don't have to keep using more opioids. It can also help deal with the cravings for opioids. This is all well understood science. So introduce cannabis as an adjunct treatment for those who are currently using opioids can help stop people from progressing to problematic use. And the third way that I think cannabis can interrupt the opioid cycle is as a replacement therapy. So when patients are going through methadone or Suboxone treatment, we want to give them the best possible chance of success, because it's at that stage of high level of dependence that they're most likely to overdose, particularly with fentanyl in our streets right now. And so by adding cannabis as an adjunct treatment to opioid or Suboxone therapy, we could get greater success rates, less cravings for opioids, and ultimately better adherence to treatment. And in fact, Tilray is conducting a study right now that's going to be starting in Ontario in the next few weeks called the Substitution of Opioid Study. It's taking place at a methadone Suboxone treatment, and we're going to be comparing those going through methadone or Suboxone treatment who use cannabis to those who don't use cannabis to see who does better in terms of adherence and treatment success. We're really excited about that and moving forward with that study. And I think all of this suggests that cannabis is not going to be the sole solution to stop people from overdosing from opioids in Canada, but it can play a significant role if we incorporate it into our policies right now. And we need some novel, interesting, and daring policies to stop the rate of overdoses going on in North America right now. So that's my presentation today. I'm more than happy to take a few questions. It's a real honor to be here with you guys today. I really want to thank all the people at LIFT, all the great volunteers who bring us all here together as a community, and happy to take some questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, I think my mic is off. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, that's a great question. The young lady asked if I found any ethnic differences in my study. What we find in this survey is that we have an overrepresentation of both First Nations and Caucasians in the study. And that's an overrepresentation we see in the entire medical marijuana program as well. And I haven't broken it down regarding ethnic responses or in that sense yet, but we will be doing that as we work out the further analysis. That's why we haven't published this data yet. It really is fresh off the presses, and we're still playing with the data to see what comes out, but I think it'd be very fascinating to look at that. One of the things we're looking at as well is gendered responses, and of course the way patients who cite different symptoms or conditions, the way they might be using cannabis differently. For example, I'm really interested, and we haven't done this analysis yet, but it's pending this week, is to see those patients that cite they see substitution for opioids, if they prefer a certain strain type or a certain method of ingestion. Are they using extracts at a higher rate, for example, because they're more narcotic in many ways than smoking or vaporization? But thank you for the question. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Hi, it's Jackie back here. Back here. Hello.
Where are you? Oh, perfect. I got lights in my eyes. Forgive me.
Thank you, Philippe. That's a great presentation. Very,
Thanks.
very informative. I just wondered, are you doing any studies with CAMH here in Ontario, and in particular schizophrenia in youth, that critical point in the say 14 to 18-year range? They're seeing it in females, but mostly in males. But are you doing anything in that mental health field yet?
No, we're not doing any studies per se that way, and I'll talk about that a little bit. There is, as many of you guys will know, an association with cannabis use and psychoses. The relationship is what we call a correlation. It's not a causal relationship. There's been no causality found, but there's really, I think, compelling data to suggest that particularly if you use cannabis at a young age, and if you've got a predisposition for psychosis or schizophrenia, that it might have an early expression in you as well. I want to say that in over 20 years of working with medical cannabis, I've actually seen what I would call cannabis-related psychosis at least 2 occasions. Now that's working with tens of thousands of patients, but I don't deny the fact that there can be a link, that there's some vulnerable populations who might have a family history of psychosis or schizophrenia who might be particularly vulnerable to this. We're not doing that kind of research because, of course, you can't design a clinical trial where you'd be giving youth cannabis and a placebo, so it's not really ripe for a clinical research. And in terms of, we do have some pediatric patients at Tilray, but they're usually younger than 10 years old. So it's certainly not a patient base that would be answering our surveys. CAMH is doing some interesting work on tracking that kind of information. The Center for Addictions Research in British Columbia, Addictions Research British Columbia, of which I'm with, tracks patient patterns of use in recreational populations. But the one thing that I find gives me some relief in all this, well, two things. There was recently one of my colleagues, Zach Walsh, and a bunch of other researchers did a systematic review of medical cannabis in mental health. And they found some interesting results, including some data that suggested that there are vulnerable populations, such as those with a predisposition. But what they also found was that there's no rise in the rate of schizophrenia or psychoses over the last 30 years, despite significant rises in the rate of cannabis use that we've seen in North America. So I think if there is an association, it's a small one. I think that this, just as it would be with other vulnerable population, youth, women who may be pregnant, suggests a target for education to me. The thing that I want to move away from is a criminal justice approach. I don't think that that's really helping keep cannabis out of the hands of youth. And if they are vulnerable, if they've got a predisposition for psychosis or schizophrenia, I think if they have those problems with cannabis, if it's no longer an illegal offense, they're more likely to seek help around those conditions. So thank you so much for the questions. And I think CAMH is doing some good work, but we're not working directly with them right now. Thanks. Thanks.
Hello?
Yes.
My name is Dan, and I'm a PhD student. I'm trying to classify cannabis strains marketed in Canada with dozens of cannabinoids and terpenes. I think this work is very fundamental for the clinical research so that you can know which strain to choose for the all kinds of conditions they are trying to treat. So my question is that, do you use cannabis as a whole medicine? Or you only focus on THC and CBD? What about the terpenes?
Great question. Tilray and all licensed producers are, by regulation, we have to list and inform patients, physicians of the THC and CBD levels. At Tilray, however, we actually do testing for about 10 different cannabinoids and 20 different terpenes. And if you're a patient at Tilray, you can go on the website and get that information. So if there are patients who are looking for cannabis with higher CBC content or CBN content, or for a high beta-caryophyllene or myrcene or linalool content in terms of terpenes, they're able to find that as well. I have to tell you that THC and CBD is just a small part of the equation when it comes to looking at cannabis. As you'll know, there's over 100 cannabinoids, over 100 terpenes that all work or appear to work synergistically in terms of their effects. And I'm more and more convinced over the years that terpenes play a bigger role in the subjective difference that patients find between one strain and another than cannabinoids. And I'm really interested in examining that. I want to say two things. If you haven't looked at the work by Carl Hillig, he did a taxonomic analysis of cannabis based on cannabinoids and terpenes. So he's got two different papers. They're from early 2000, about 2004. I highly encourage that. And the thing that he did, which was really neat, is he took away this kind of artificial classification we have of indicas, sativas, and hybrids, and he suggested that all high THC strains are actually indica strains, and he calls them wide-leaf and narrow-leafed indicas to identify the different morphology of those strains. He suggests sativas are all the hemp strains. There's great work that's been done on this also by John Page at Anandia, and Anandia Labs has a booth right around the corner from here, and they've done some great publications looking at this as well. What I can tell you about Tilray strains is we've done some of that analysis based on terpene and cannabinoid content. And what we found is that rather than the classic indica sativa hybrid splits that we see, we saw when we did scatter plot analysis, 7 different subgroups of strains emerged based on cannabinoid and terpene content when we overlaid the two together. So there's a lot more work to do on this. It's going to take a lot more research. I'm really encouraged that someone like you is taking this on, because I think we need some good hard science to be able to look at this and better understand that relationship right now. Thank you. Thank you. I've been told that I'm out of time. It's been a real pleasure presenting for you guys today. Have a great day all. Enjoy the show.